What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. The power of certain Pokemon is undeniable, with them being able to destroy the whole universe if they wanted. But even if most Pokemon aren't quite at that level, there are still some terrors out there, largely thanks to many Pokemon being able to evolve and gain new powers and capabilities. However, not every Pokemon that evolves guarantees that it will become all that powerful, and in fact, there are some Pokemon that are fully evolved that are weaker than ones that don't get blessed with this gift. So then, what exactly is considered the wimpiest fully evolved Pokemon from each region? Well, first of all, for the purposes of our list, we'll be considering fully evolved Pokemon as having an actual evolution. So, as wimpy as the likes of Pyukumuku or Luvdisc might be, they are not fully evolved if they've never evolved at all, right? Plus, who's to say that they won't change that later on, making them a base stage? Of course, you could then say that about any non-3-stage line, but we gotta start somewhere, right? So, for Kanto, we've got a good idea at some candidates with Butterfree and Beedrill. These Pokemon are disadvantaged for being found so early, meaning that the game is pretty much designed to make them obsolete and force better options into your hands. I mean, they only have a 395 base stat total, which gets so far outclassed by the end of the game. Or even other similar early Pokemon like Arbok with a 438 stat total, which is surprisingly low compared to other Pokemon, like even Golduck at 500. However, Arbok fares a bit better because stats are not the only thing to consider. Pure Poison is a very solid typing, even with a bunch of OP Psychic types running around in Gen 1, but if we are in Gen 1, then it's got things like Wrap to freeze the opponents, and if it's later on, then it's got Glare and other useful tricks. So then where does that leave us? Well, given everything, I would say that Parasect is probably the wimpiest. Its base stat total is only 405, which is barely above those other bugs, and while its attack stat might be decent, it invests way too much in its defenses for being a bug and grass type, meaning that it's all basically just thrown away with such an awful type combination having 2 quad weaknesses, and at one point a third to the poison type as well. Not to mention it is slower than a snail. I know that they can be aggressive in Pokemon Legends Arceus, but it's not like they're actually a threat, they're more just a minor annoyance in that game. Now, the Johto region has quite a few Pokemon that are surprisingly unsuited for battle, such as the Unknown or Delivered, and even with its move pool gimmick, Smeargle has a shockingly low 250 stat total. But none of these are evolved nor capable of evolution. Sorry, Iron Bundle fans. So instead, maybe we could look at Furret, who is a lowly regional rodent after all, with just a 415 base stat total. But honestly, Pure Normal isn't that bad, and it generally comes with a huge potential array of moves, including Baton Pass, so Furret can be a solid team player if you use it right. A little below that is Ariados at a flat 400. It is quite shockingly slow, I didn't realize how slow, but it's not a bad Pokemon, the poison type certainly helps, and it does get unique spider tricks to boot. But unfortunately, its counterpart has it much worse when you look at Ledian. For some reason, they gave it even lower stats with 390, and it does have a really high special defense stat, so that's good. Fire won't be as much of a problem, but you should really be much more concerned about Rock, since Bug and Flying type is quad weak to the largely physical Rock. Not to mention that both of its attacks put together are still less than 100, so it's not very good at hitting hard or staying alive for a long time, so it's got a pretty great shot at being one of the wimpiest Pokemon ever, but at least for the Johto region, it's got a lock. Hohen has a bunch of nice, strong Pokemon out there, and even the ones that slip through the cracks sometimes aren't too shabby. There are some letdowns, like Spinda having nothing but 60s in every stat, although that does make a 360 total, which is quite fitting for this Pokemon. But of course there are the usual bugs, and this time they have just a 385 base stat total. However, oddly, poor Delcatty is in a worse spot with only 380 points. It seems bizarre to make this cat weaker than Route 1 Pokemon, well at least until Gen 7 when they boosted its speed by 20 points, but that still left it to fade ever more into obscurity for 4 whole generations. Also, the Normalize ability isn't really one of the best signature abilities around, however it is not as useless as people seem to think, nor is this cat in general. So it may be debatable, but I think the title for Gen 3 could go to Shedinja. I know that it's got a good gimmick. but the fact that it only has 1 HP means that it takes a huge cut in its base stats, only leaving it with 236, which is actually lower than Nincada before it. I get why they couldn't give it any HP, but they could have put those points into something else like special attack or something, just to bring it up to an actual evolved standard. Once you figure out its trick, all you have to do is set up Sandstorm, and then it falls faster than if it were holding an Iron Ball. It's not a bad Pokemon, but is it wimpy? Oh yeah. So Cinna was a bit harder, because they've got some pretty decent Pokemon out there, and a bunch of them were honestly just legendaries or evolutions to already strong Pokemon, so not a lot of room for wimps. However, there are others like Cherrim that make a pretty good play for the title, with its bad typing and reliance on the sun, with that only strengthening the fire type that it's weak against, but I think we gotta go with Kricketune. Yeah, they keep making their bugs weaker since this one only has a 384 stat total, and somehow, despite having swords for arms, its physical attack is strangely below Shedinja that we just mentioned. That doesn't sound right at all, but that's what they decided to go with. I knew that I ditched Kricketune pretty early on in the game, but now I know that there were numbers backing me up, because this thing has got to be one of the wimpiest Pokemon from the DS, even ranking below past bugs out there. Now, Unova has a ton of strong evolved Pokemon, so it was pretty hard to narrow it down, but I would say that the first option is probably Watchog. This safety weasel is not all that impressive with a 420 base stat total, but it is a normal type with lots of moves, so maybe it's got a chance, we'll have to see. But I do think that Swoobat has a shot here as well. It's not much better with only 425 in its base stats, and most of that is its blistering speed. This Lovebat's attack and defenses are all below Watchog, and the rest are not significantly higher either. And to me, even if Watchog doesn't have raw power, it's more of a utility pick anyway, being able to use Hypnosis, Detect, Mean Look, Super Fang, and more. And hey, maybe I'm just missing how good Swoobat is at utility as well, but plainly put, it's just got more weaknesses to exploit than Watchog does. And plus, Swoobat is gonna be outclassed by Sigilyph in any meaningful way. So maybe I could get persuaded otherwise, but for now I'm leaning towards Swoobat being the wimp out of the Gen 5 newcomers. Kalos trims things down with not a lot of choices. I mean, there is Aromatisse, who even the developers seem to dislike because they severely cut its stats compared to its direct counterpart, which I can only assume was done out of spite, but really there's not much else. All the other fully evolved Pokemon are decently strong. I mean, the worst that you could say about Pangoro is that it's got an easily exploitable Quad Fairy weakness, but then again, it's also got Priority Bullet Punch on a 124 attack stat. So then I think we gotta go back to our standard bug type, because Vivion is a mere 411 in its base stat total, which is far lower than even Dedenne, who doesn't evolve at all. It's pretty bad for a Pokemon that's evolved twice to be outclassed by such tiny fairies later into the game. And it's a shame to waste all those cool patterns on such a wimpy Pokemon, whose only real use is spamming powder. Alola has an even bigger gulf between weird one-off Pokemon that are kind of bizarre and don't evolve, and tougher actual evolutions throughout the dex. As much as it pains me to say in terms of raw numbers, I think Araquanid is actually in the running here, since 454 is pretty low by Gen 7 standards, a power creep if ever I saw one. But this Surfing Spider is not a bad Pokemon, just maybe a little slow and not as hard-hitting as its friend Golisopod. Even Ribombee, whose stats are slightly higher, could be considered wimpier because it is more fragile. But who am I kidding? It's Shiinotic. It's got the same base stats as Parasect, which is a huge letdown for a mushroom 6 generations later. And sure, it's got some nice tools like Strength Sap, but those other Pokemon that I mentioned from Alola are better supports. Plus, you can easily take advantage of Shiinotic's abysmal speed and its crippling 4 times weakness to poison. So apparently mushrooms just trade off on whether they decide to be useful or not. Up next comes Galar, and most of these Pokemon are stronger than the ones that came before just by nature of being from Gen 8, when the likes of Thievul and Greedent are your lowest numbers, and they're in the mid-400s. But while Thievul might indeed have a chance in the running, I think for the title of the Wimpiest, we can credibly include Frostmoth here. Its stat total of 475 is not that much higher, and really, despite its massive special attack, Bug and Ice makes this Pokemon quad weak to rock and fire, so it's about as flimsy of a glass cannon as can be. Once again, I'm not saying that Frostmoth is a terrible choice of a Pokémon, just expect it not to last quite as long as the rest of your team when it's basically made out of paper. And now we have Paldea giving us a whole new crop of Pokémon. And of course, even when considered fully evolved, Wugtrio is by modern standards a bit low. It's actually pretty funny because the only reason Wugtrio is considered weak on paper is because it has the exact same stat total as Dugtrio, so that immediately makes them outdated, but I don't think anyone could believably say Dugtrio is a bad Pokémon, maybe just a little bit frail if you can survive one of its hard, fast hits. But really, that's nothing compared to Spidops. I'm not trying to hate on it or anything, but it's even a point lower than Shiinotic, making it painfully slow and just pure bug? When a Pokémon is that comparatively weak, you gotta give it something to make it stand out from the rest, but there's nothing to make you want to use this spider over any other past bugs that are also in this game, truly exemplifying the wimpiness of this arachnid trying way too hard to be a killer human robot thing, despite its lack of adequate attack efforts. I mean, the other early game Gen 9 Pokémon are way higher than this, so why did they even make Spidops if they wanted you to use anything else? And that's all the regions to date. Well, except Hisui, I guess, but none of those Pokemon introduced were all that wimpy. Technically, Kleavor has the lowest base stat total at 500, but that's just because they couldn't let it surpass Scizor. If you had to twist my arm, I'd probably say Sneasler is the wimpiest, just because it's barely above Kleavor, and it has a quad weakness to Psychic that is easily exploited. And really, if you're gonna dress the part of a wimp, how can I not call you one? I don't know which of these fully evolved Pokemon would be considered the overall wimpiest, and that's not even really the point, but it is interesting to see that most of them, by the numbers and common sense I guess, seem to be bug-type. We probably should have guessed that from the beginning anyway. But at the same time, on average, there are Pokemon from every region who cannot evolve that fare a little bit worse than those in the running here. So it seems like evolution can at least save you from being the absolute biggest wimp, even if you do end up being the wimpiest of the fully evolved Pokemon. What factors do you think makes the wimpiest fully evolved Pokemon? Let me know down in the comments. Also, be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!